There is a tree that grows in Brooklyn. Nobody plants it. It pushes up through the cracks in cement, out of the grading over a cellar, out of abandoned lots and the swept bare yards of tenements, and it is the only tree that will grow there. It doesn't need soil. It doesn't need sun. It only needs to be left alone, and it likes poor people best. In the summer of 1912, on a fire escape in Williamsburg, an 11-year-old girl named Francie Nolan sits reading beside one of those trees. She has no money, a father who drinks, and a mother who scrubs floors for their rent. And yet, before this story is over, that same girl will board a train out of Brooklyn for good. The tree in her yard will be chopped to the ground, and it will grow back anyway. This is how. Saturday was the best day, because Saturday was money day. Francie and her brother Neely dragged their collected treasure to Carney the junkman. Rags, paper, tinfoil peeled from gum wrappers, flattened cans, a horseshoe if God was kind. Carney weighed it, cheated them gently, and pinched Francie's cheek for an extra penny. Half of everything they earned went straight home into a tin can bank, nailed into the back of the closet floor. You could push coins in through a slot cut with a can opener, but you could not easily get them out. The bank had one purpose, whispered like a prayer in that family. Someday, somehow, the Nolans would own a piece of land. They were dirt poor, but they were saving, coin by coin, toward the idea that poverty was not the end of the story. Two people held that home together, and they could not have been more different. Katie Nolan, the mother, was the janitress of the building, young, beautiful, and hard as a scrubbing brush on her knees. Before dawn, washing the tenement stairs so the family had a roof. She loved fiercely, and she did not bend. And then there was Johnny. Johnny Nolan was a singing waiter, and he was the most beloved man on the block. Handsome, tender, full of songs. The kind of father who made a child feel the whole world was music. He was also drinking himself to death, one job at a time. Francie adored him. Katie had already stopped waiting for him to change, and the terrible truth the whole neighborhood half knew was that the man everybody loved was the man slowly breaking this family apart. To understand the Nolans, you have to go back one generation to a boat from Austria. Francie's grandmother, Mary Romley, came to America unable to read a single word in any language. She married a cruel man and raised her daughters into the tenements. Katie, warm, reckless sissy. Sharp-tongued Evie. They were servant girls and factory girls who married young and stayed poor. Katie was 17 when she met Johnny at a dance. He was singing, and that was enough. They married fast and were hungry inside a year. By the time Francie was born, Katie had already learned the lesson of her whole class, that a woman could work until her hands bled and still have nothing. So when her first child came, she went to the one person who might know how to break the cycle, her illiterate immigrant mother. Katie asked her mother a desperate question. How do you make a child's life better than your own? And Mary Romley, who could not read, gave her a plan so simple it sounded like magic. Every single night, she said, you must read the child one page from a great book. Read her Shakespeare. Read her the Bible. It doesn't matter that you don't understand every word. The child will grow up hearing that language and thinking it is ordinary. Fill her head with fairy tales and saints and giants, so she owns a thing more valuable than money, an imagination, a secret country no landlord can evict her from, and save, always save, until you own a bit of land. It was a poor woman's blueprint for lifting a child out of poverty using the only currency they had for free, words. And Katie followed it to the letter. And then came the hour that changed everything. The day Francie realized she could read, that the black marks resolved into words, and the words into worlds. The narrow street cracked open into infinity. She made herself a vow. She would read every book in the library straight through the alphabet, A to Z, one book a day forever. She'd carry them home and read on the fire escape under the tree, a chipped brown bowl with a single flower on the windowsill beside her, feeling rich. Her family had almost no money, but Francie Nolan had just discovered a fortune that cost nothing and could never be taken. From that time on, the whole world was hers for the reading. The plan her grandmother drew was working. The problem was that the world outside the page had not agreed to be kind. The lesson arrived at a free vaccination clinic. Francie and Neely had spent the morning making mud pies. so their arms were caked with dirt when the doctor, a young man from a good college doing his charity hours, took one look and said it out loud to the nurse, as if the child couldn't hear filth. 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 I know they're poor, but they could wash. Francie was small and ragged and terrified of the needle, but she looked up at him and said, evenly, that her brother was coming in next, and his arm would be just as dirty, so the doctor shouldn't be surprised. She would not let them think a poor child was too stupid to understand contempt. It was the first time the world told Francie Nolan she was dirt. It would not be the last, and every time, she answered with the same quiet, unbreakable dignity. Francie hated her school. Overcrowded, cruel, the poor kids beaten, and the teachers indifferent. But on her long walks, she found another school, far outside her district, in a quieter neighborhood. Smaller classes, a garden. Teachers who looked at children like they mattered. She wanted it so badly it hurt. There was only one problem. You could only attend the school in your own district, and the Nolans lived in the wrong one. So Johnny, the failing father, the drinker who could rarely hold a job, did the one masterful thing of his life. He walked Francie to a house near the good school, wrote down that fake address as their home, and marched in to enroll her, charming the registrar with his singing waiter smile. It worked. And through his weakness, Johnny gave his daughter the single most important door of her childhood. Christmas Eve on the block had a brutal tradition. Whatever trees the peddlers hadn't sold by midnight, they gave away, but you had to earn one. You stood at the far end of the lot and let the peddler hurl the biggest unsold tree at you full force. If it knocked you down, you got nothing. If you stayed on your feet, the tree was yours. That year, the biggest tree left was a monster, 10 feet tall, and by tradition, it was thrown at the smallest ones who dared. Francie and Neely, half its size, stepped up together and asked for it. The whole street held its breath as the peddler took aim and threw. The tree hit them like a wall. They staggered. They did not go down. And two ragged children dragged a giant Christmas tree home through the snow, having stood against the full weight of the world and won. There were nights with no money and no food, and on those nights, Katie did something extraordinary. She turned starvation into a story. The family, she announced, were explorers stranded at the North Pole, rationing their last supplies with heroic discipline. Courage, my men, she'd say, portioning out stale bread as if it were expedition gold. Help will come soon. Neely played along completely thrilled, but Francie, older now, looked at the game a beat too long, and then quietly told her mother that she'd found the catch in it. She knew they weren't explorers. She knew they were simply hungry, and that the game was her mother's love disguised as make-believe. That was the beginning of the hardest thing about growing up. Francie was starting to see through the beautiful stories to the plain, hard truth underneath them. Once you start seeing clearly, you can't stop. The melodramas at the cheap theater, which used to thrill her, now looked like cardboard. The neighborhood magic thinned out. Francie was learning that growing up isn't something that happens to you all at once. It's a slow trading of one gift for another. You lose the child's power to believe the North Pole game. In exchange, you gain the adult's power to survive the real thing. She began to understand that the tenement she lived in was not the safe, enchanted world of her fairy tale books. It was a place where hard things happened to people who could not defend themselves. Women shamed in the street. Children who went hungry and worse. And the street was about to prove exactly how hard it could be. Francie watched the neighborhood turn on the weak, and she never forgot it. There was a young, unmarried woman named Joanna who wheeled her baby proudly down the block in the sunshine, and the respectable married women of the street, scandalized, drove her off with cruelty, a thrown stone catching the baby. Francie stood there sickened, understanding for the first time how pitiless her own people could be to a woman who stepped outside the line. She saw how thin the protection was around a poor girl, how quickly a community could become a mob. It was a lesson in fear and in mercy. Francie swore, silently, that whatever she became, she would not become one of the women who threw stones. But fear, real fear, was still coming for her personally, and it wore the shape of a man in a dark hallway. A predator had been stalking the children of the neighborhood, and one had already been killed. One evening, on the dim stairs of her own building, The man cornered Francie alone. She froze. And in that instant, everything her mother was got proven at once. Katie, who had borrowed a revolver from the building's night watchman, precisely because she feared this day, heard her daughter, came fast, and stopped him. She did not scream or faint or wait for a policeman. She stood between her child and the danger, and she ended it. Then and there. Francie was shaken, but unharmed, and she understood something she would carry forever. Her mother might be hard, might love Neely a little more, might never say the tender words Johnny said so easily, but Katie Nolan was the wall between her children and everything that wanted to devour them. And the wall did not fall. But there was one danger even Katie couldn't shoot. The drink was winning. Johnny's hands shook now. The singing jobs dried up. The charming man arrived home less and less, and worse and worse. Katie was pregnant again, scrubbing floors up to the last week, and the household teetered on nothing. Francie still loved her father with her whole aching heart, loved the songs, the tenderness, the way he made poverty feel briefly like an adventure. But she was old enough now to see where it was going. Johnny knew it too. Ashamed, unemployable, drowning. He disappeared for 2 days into the cold, and when they found him, the man who had made his daughter believe the world was music had almost nothing left. The father everyone loved had run out of road. Katie said it plainly, because there was no soft way. Your father is dead. Johnny Nolan died of pneumonia and drink, worn out at 34. And then Katie did one last thing for the man she had stopped waiting for, but never stopped loving. When the certificate was to be written, she quietly had it record the cause as pneumonia alone, not the drinking. Let the neighborhood, let the children, let history remember Johnny Nolan as a man who caught cold and died young, and not as a drunk. It was fierce, and it was tender, and it was the truest thing she ever did. The tree in the yard was cut back hard that winter, and a family that had survived on almost nothing now had to survive on less, with a baby coming, and the 2 children suddenly, permanently grown. At Francie and Neely's grammar school graduation, every child had flowers on their desk except they feared the 2 whose father had just died. And then the flowers came, 2 dozen roses for Francie, with a card in Johnny's handwriting and words of love. Before he died, sensing perhaps what was coming, Johnny had arranged and paid for them, so his children would not stand empty on their proudest day. Francie wept over roses ordered by a dead man. It was Johnny in a single gesture, unreliable in life, unable to hold a job or a bottle, and yet capable of a love so thoughtful it reached past his own grave. The father was gone. The lesson stayed. People can fail you completely and love you completely, both at once. And now Francie had to become the one who held things up. Francie wanted to be a writer, and she wrote what she knew. Honest stories about a father who drank, about being poor, about the real texture of tenement life. Her teacher, Miss Garnder, handed them back with low grades and a verdict. These subjects were sordid. Poverty and drunkenness, she explained, were neither truth nor beauty. A proper young lady should write about lovely things. The world was telling Francie that her own life, the only life she had, was too shameful to put on paper. For a moment she believed it, and she burned her old stories in the stove. But then something in her hardened, the same steel that was in Katie. Her life was not sordid. It was hers. It was true. And she made a decision that would carry her out of Brooklyn. She would write the truth anyway, and she would make the world call it beautiful. With Johnny gone and a baby in the house, childhood was over. At 14, Francie left school and went to work in Manhattan to keep the family fed. She was hired at a press clipping bureau where readers raced through dozens of newspapers marking every article a client had paid to track. And Francie, who had read the entire library A to Z, was soon the fastest reader in the room. She earned real wages. She rode the ferry to a job across the river, a poor Brooklyn girl in the wider world. But she had traded away the thing she wanted most, her education, to survive. She was clothing and feeding her mother and brother and baby sister, and late at night she made herself a second harder vow. This would not be the end of her schooling. Somehow, she was going to college. It should have been impossible. Francie had never finished high school, so how could she reach a university? But she found a crack in the wall. Summer college courses she could test into if she was good enough. She enrolled, the youngest and least schooled in the room, and she was good enough. And there she met Ben Blake. Brilliant, disciplined, going places. A boy who had mapped out his whole ambitious future and casually assumed Francie belonged in it. Ben believed in her the way no teacher ever had. He gave her his ring. He told her which university to aim for. Where Johnny had been all charm and no plan, Ben was all plan, and he pointed that plan straight at Francie's future. For the first time, the college dream stopped being a fantasy and started looking like an appointment she might actually keep. But first, her heart had to be broken, the way everyone's first is. Before Ben, there was a soldier, Lee, home briefly from the war, who swept Francie off her feet in a matter of days. She fell completely. He asked her to write to him while he was away, to be his girl, and she poured herself onto the page in love letters. And then came another letter, telling her that Lee had gone home and married someone else, a girl he'd been engaged to all along. Francie was shattered. She went to her mother raw with it, and Katie, who had loved a charming man and paid for it, gave her the hard truth. You'll survive this, and you'll be stronger, and you'll never again be quite so easy to fool. Francie had learned love could lie. She did not let it make her bitter. She let it make her wiser. Meanwhile, the family's luck was quietly turning. For years, a good and steady man had loved Katie from a respectful distance. Sergeant McShane, an Irish policeman, honorable, kind, and by now a widower with a little money and a seat waiting for him in local politics. He came to Katie at last with a proposal that was almost too large to believe. Marry me, and I will send both Francie and Neely to college, and I will raise the baby as my own. It was everything the Tin Can Bank had ever dreamed of, arriving all at once, through the door of a good marriage instead of a scrimped coin. It was not the wild music Johnny had been. It was something Katie had never once had in her life, security. And she said yes, for herself, and for the children who had gone without so long. There was a new baby in the house now, little Annie Laurie, born after Johnny died. And looking at her, Francie understood the whole shape of her family's story. This baby would grow up warm and fed. She would never haul junk to Kearney for pennies, never play the North Pole game, never feel a doctor's contempt or a teacher's word for being poor. And the reason was Francie and Neely, the two who had gone hungry, who had left school to work, who had absorbed the hardness so the next child wouldn't have to. That is how a poor family climbs. Not all at once, but generation over generation, each one lifting the next a little higher off the pavement. Like the tree, growing from the same battered stump, a new shoot reaching higher than the last. The Nolans were rising, and Francie was about to rise clean off the block. And then the impossible thing simply happened. Francie Nolan, the janitress's daughter, the girl the doctor called Filth, the writer whose life was called Sordid, sat in her tenement 2 days before a train would carry her to the University of Michigan. College, a real university, hundreds of miles from Brooklyn, with her tuition secured and her future her own. Everything the grandmother's plan had promised was coming true. The nightly page of Shakespeare, the library read A to Z. The imagination no one could evict. All of it had been slowly building this exact escape. The bit of land the family never quite managed to buy turned out to be something better. The real ground the Nolans had been cultivating all along, coin by coin and book by book, was a child. And that child was ready for harvest. On her last Saturday, Francie walked the neighborhood to say goodbye and found that she loved it, now that she was leaving it. She passed Cheap Charlie's candy store where she'd never once won the good prize. She passed the school where she'd been miserable and the park where she'd been happy. And she went into the library, to the librarian who, in all those years of a book a day, had never once looked up at her face, and to the little brown bowl on the desk that always held a single flower, the small daily beauty that had told a poor child the world could be lovely. She was not the same girl who had made those rounds 1,000 times. She was leaving, but she understood, finally, that this hard, mean, magical street had made her, and that she would carry all of it with her, out into the world. Francie looked out her window one last time at the yard and at the tree. Some time back, the landlord had ordered it chopped down, hacked to the ground because its stubborn roots were lifting the concrete, because nobody wanted a weed tree that grew where it wasn't planted. It should have been the end of it. But there, climbing straight up out of the dead stump, was a new tree. Green, alive, already reaching over the fence toward the open sky. You could cut it down. You could pave it over. You could give it nothing. And it grew anyway, because that was simply the kind of tree it was. The tree that grows out of cement. The tree that likes poor people. The tree that cannot be killed by being told it doesn't belong. Francie Nolan looked at it, and she knew exactly what she was looking at. She was looking at herself. On a neighboring fire escape, a younger girl sat reading, a child named Florrie Wendy, 11 years old, in the middle of the exact childhood Francie was about to leave behind forever. Francie watched her a long moment. The reading, the fire escape, the tree, the whole poor and enchanted world she was 2 days from escaping. And she felt it all close gently behind her, the way a book closes when you've reached the last page and finally understand what it was about. She had been that girl. She would never be her again. "Goodbye, Francie," she whispered to Florrie and to the child she herself had been, and she closed the window. The tree grows in Brooklyn still, up through the cracks in the cement, everywhere the world says nothing good can grow. That was always the secret. The poorest ground, given only words and stubborn love, can raise something that reaches all the way to heaven.